So, on June 25th, 1950, while most of the world was looking the other way, the very first shots of a long, brutal war were fired on this tiny, isolated peninsula in Korea. We're going to dive into the story of that very first battle, a really chaotic fight that, honestly, set the stage for everything that came after. And it all starts with a decision that, at first glance, makes absolutely no sense at all.
Right? This is the central question of this whole explainer. And it's a real head-scratcher. It just goes against all military logic. I mean, try to put yourself in the commander's shoes for a second. Your soldiers are right in the middle of a successful counterattack. Their morale is soaring. So why in the world would you give the order to fall back? Just try to picture the scene. It's the very first day of the war. South Korean soldiers, we'll call them the Roka, are outnumbered, big time. But somehow, through pure grit, they manage to turn the tables, surround the invaders, and start pushing them back. It looks like victory is actually possible. And then, right at the peak of their success, this unbelievable order comes down from headquarters. Retreat, immediately.
To understand that order, which sounds completely insane, you first have to understand the ground they were fighting on. The Ongjin Peninsula, well, it wasn't just a battlefield. It was a strategic nightmare. A real tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. You can see right here how the geography just created this natural death trap. Look at it. The peninsula is boxed in by the sea on three sides. The only way in or out by land was straight through enemy territory. Their entire supply line, every bullet, every bit of food, it all depended on that one tiny port, Pupo. For all intents and purposes, it was an island, and holding it was frankly impossible from day one.
And the odds? They were just staggering. The North Korean People's Army, the KPA, rolled in with 11,000 troops, self-propelled guns, armored vehicles, you name it. And the South Korean defenders, the Roka, they had just 3,600 men to hold a 45-kilometer front. They were outmanned more than 3-1 and just massively outgunned.
So, the man in charge of this impossible defense was Colonel Paik In-yup, and he knew exactly how bad his position was. He saw the storm clouds gathering, so he did everything he could. He even got local civilians to help dig trenches and build up their positions. This was a commander who saw exactly what was coming.
But, and this is the tragic part, his warnings were completely ignored. Just one day, one single day before the invasion, some UN observers visited his post. They looked at his preparations not as a smart defense, but as a provocation. They literally told him he was creating tensions and ordered him to lower the alert level. So against his own gut feeling, Colonel Paik had to stand his man down.
And then, in the dark, early hours of June 25th, that tinderbox finally exploded. The invasion began.
The attack just ramped up with terrifying speed. At 4 a.m., the sky lights up with flares, and a huge artillery barrage just slams into the Roka lines. For a full, agonizing hour, the South Korean artillery wasn't even allowed to shoot back because of peacetime rules. By 5:10, comms were already cut. By 6:10, a battalion commander was dead, and the western flank was collapsing. It was just pure chaos.
But right in the middle of all that chaos, Colonel Paik made a really bold move. A move that would create this brief, shining glimmer of hope and bring us right back to that central question we started with.
With the western flank just crumbling, Paik played his final card. He sent in his only reserve force, the 2nd Battalion. They were led by this tough, really determined officer named Major Song Ho Rim. And their orders were simple. Plug the gap and push the enemy back, no matter what.
And you know what? Incredibly, it worked. Major Song's men hit the advancing KPA so hard and so fast, they actually caused a panic. They managed to surround the enemy, they pounded them with mortars, and they started retaking the very ground they had just lost. I mean, in this one little section of the front, they weren't just holding on, they were winning.
But here's the thing. While Major Song's men were being heroes and pushing forward, the big picture was turning grim. On the other side of the battlefield, the eastern flank was getting completely crushed by KPA tanks. The entire 17th Regiment was just moments away from being sliced in two, and that would have left Major Song's victorious battalion totally cut off and surrounded. All of a sudden, that order to retreat, well, it wasn't admitting defeat. It was their only shot at survival.
So what happened next wasn't just a retreat. It was a desperate, really clever race to the sea, a great escape against completely impossible odds.
Colonel Paik knew he had to buy time, so he came up with this brilliant deception. First, he ordered his men to fire every single shell they had left, to make the KPA think they were digging in for a massive fight. Then, he created this ghost convoy. He took all 85 of his trucks and had them drive in a loop, from the port to the front with their headlights blazing to look like reinforcements, and then back to the port in the dark to actually evacuate his men. He was fighting a battle of perception. And the result of all this was just sheer pandemonium at the ports. You have the sound of KPA guns getting closer and closer, and thousands of soldiers, police, terrified civilians, all desperately scrambling onto any fishing boat, any vessel that could float, just trying to get off that doomed peninsula.
That desperate gamble was costly, for sure, but it was also crucial. Out of the roughly 3,600 Roca troops there, about 700 were killed, wounded, or went missing. But nearly 2,900 of them, the vast majority of the regiment, were saved. Colonel Pike's retreat preserved his force so they could fight another day.
And get this, in a final, just incredible act of leadership, Colonel Pike himself stayed behind to fire the very last howitzer, providing covering fire for the last of the boats. It was only after that gun was dumped into the sea that he finally escaped on a tiny fishing boat, the very last commander to leave his post.
But the Battle of Ongjin didn't end when the shooting stopped. Oh no, it immediately moved to a brand new front, a war of words. And this is where the very first lie of the Korean War was born. It all started with a simple but catastrophic misquote. A reporter asked Colonel Pike about his future plans. He probably said something hopeful, like he hoped one day he will advance to Haeju, which is a city in North Korea. But by the time that got on the radio in Seoul, the tense of the verb had changed. It was reported as a fact. The Raqqa is advancing to Haeju.
This one little change spawned the myth of the capture of Haeju. So while Pike's men were literally fighting for their lives to escape a death trap, radio stations back in the south were celebrating a glorious victory and the capture of an enemy city. It was the complete opposite of the truth.
And this single piece of fake news had massive consequences. Sure, it gave a brief false boost to civilian morale, but it also totally confused friendly commanders who were trying to make strategic decisions based on a lie. And worst of all, it handed North Korea this golden propaganda tool that they used for years to claim that it was South Korea that had invaded first.
The actual Battle of Ongjin was over in about 48 hours, but that false story, the story of the capture of Haeju, echoed for decades. Which leaves us with one final lingering question. In a war of both guns and words, which bullet really travels further?